Starting. 383. 56. 715. 511. 262.
Welcome to the 3% Podcast. This is Chad Post from Open Letter Books, and today we have this is a special part of our weekly episode in which Ben Lindbergh, the author of The MVP Machine with Trevor Sawchek and the author of The Only Rule It Has to Work, our wild experiment building a new kind of baseball team that he co-wrote with Sam Miller, and the host of Effectively Wild podcast, is joining me today to talk about his new book and about his writing process. Hi, Ben.
Hi, good to be here.
It's very intimidating to do that after listening to 1,363 introductions of Effectively Wild's podcast, which you guys have down so smooth.
Well, you don't always hear when we flub it, so we don't get it perfect every time.
It's smart to be able to do that. We the other podcast I do is live on YouTube, and there was for a while like a running bingo game that you could play, and one of the bingo squares you can mark off is when I screw up the introduction, which is like almost a given.
Yeah, no way to edit when you're doing it live.
Nope, not at all. So we just always have to let it go. So thank you for coming on again. This is really fantastic to be able to talk to you. And your new book, The MVP Machine, just came out just before Father's Day, correct?
Yes, that's right.
So do you want to give the pitch of it?
Sure. Well, this is a book about player development in baseball, and that's a very important topic by baseball standards that has been overlooked and undercovered and really hasn't been a focus of the analytics sabermetrics revolution until very recently, which is kind of what we're chronicling. So we talk about the whole history of player development, but we focus on the past few years because this is where the revolution in baseball is happening right now. This is the next frontier, perhaps the final frontier. And for those who are familiar with Moneyball, the book or the movie, or just the philosophy, that's what we've been talking about for the past 15 years or so. And the idea behind Moneyball was, how can you go out and find pre-existing talent, guys who are already good, but for whatever reason, the market undervalues them, just doesn't realize what their contributions are. Right. Now you can't really win that way because every team is very smart about looking at stats and appraising players' past performance. And so now the big inefficiency, the big competitive advantage is not finding talent that already exists, but creating or enhancing talent, using technology and tools to find ways to make players better. And there's been a whole succession of players who've gone from bad to good, from good to great, guys who have really turned around their careers using technology, using data in an exciting way.
Yeah, it's amazing the amount of the amount of technology that's laid out in here is incredible to me. Like even when you're talking about for anyone who's unfamiliar, Driveline is one of the main players in the book and is a place out in Seattle. It's Kyle Bodie who runs it, correct?
Right.
I wasn't sure if I was ever pronouncing that right in my head. And he's helped kind of revolutionize the way that people look at pitching and do drills for pitching and prepare in the off season, with Trevor Bauer being one of his big name brand accomplishments. But when you describe all the different technology that's being used, like all the terms, everything feels like a whole nother world.
Yeah, it's very different. I think all of these tools have come along in the past few years. You have trackers that can tell you exactly how batted balls are moving and how pitched balls are moving, so you can see with much greater clarity how a ball is spinning, how it's moving, how it's traveling on its way to the plate. And you can get the exit velocity, how hard a batted ball is hit, and the launch angle, the angle at which it's hit. So these are things that in the past you could eyeball and you could kind of approximate, but you couldn't really quantify with the precision that we can today. And meanwhile, you have sensors that you can attach to a bat to see exactly how a hitter is swinging, or to the hitter's body so you can see exactly how he's moving, and to the pitcher's body so that you can get a clear picture of his mechanics and the stresses involved at various points. And so you can break down exactly what players are doing these days in a way that you just couldn't before. And now you can really identify their flaws. And once you identify the flaws, you can fix them. And I keep saying you, but players themselves can do it. Players are kind of at the forefront of this movement, which we think sets this apart from Moneyball and from some of the other books in the Moneyball mold that were sort of top-down, team-centric. The GM has this smart idea and enforces it and imposes it on the players. This is really driven by players who are hungry for this information, who came up in this era where players are steeped in stats and they're really not as reflexively suspicious of numbers and of nerds who never played the game, and there isn't really this jocks versus nerds divide anymore. The players are hungry for this information. They want whatever they can get because they've seen their peers and fellow players benefit and really turn around their careers and make a lot more money than they would have otherwise. And so naturally, word has spread in the clubhouse and players are asking each other, hey, what are you doing? How can I be more like you?
It's really incredible to think about because it does feel like a really cool like feedback loop where you're seeing what is working, or you can the people who are smart and into the data and know all about the measurements that are being done can sort of identify where their great strengths or minor weaknesses, and then be able to get that feedback so quickly and immediately seems such a different process than even 10 years ago, where a player would just have the results and maybe some feel, but like nothing so immediate.
Right. It's that immediate feedback, that very tight feedback loop that helps with this process, because in the past, maybe you could adjust something and then you could take it into a game and you could see over the process of weeks or months whether it worked very well. But now you just don't need that sort of time and sample size to figure out whether something will benefit you. You can literally take a few swings, throw a few pitches, and you can see exactly how they behaved and extrapolate from that. So a pitcher today in a bullpen session or a hitter in batting practice, they're not just kind of lazily warming up and taking some swings and not really challenging themselves. There's this idea of deliberate practice, of constantly pushing yourself to be a little bit better, doing something that is difficult for you to do as a way of mastering something that you can't currently do. And you can get that immediate grade essentially on how you're doing. So when a pitcher is throwing in a bullpen session, he might have a high-speed, high-definition camera trained on his fingers so that he can see exactly how the ball is coming out of his hands in unprecedented detail, ways that pitchers in the past couldn't even see what they were doing and were surprised when they looked at this footage and said, I didn't know that I was doing things that way. Now you can see the ball coming out of the hand, and then you can have some other device set up that tracks the spin and the spin axis and the movement of the pitch. And so you can adjust pitch by pitch. Okay, this moved a little bit more like I wanted it to move. Maybe I was doing this with my fingers. Let's go check the footage and see what I was doing right. Or this is a little bit further away from what I wanted it to be. So what did I do wrong? And what can I adjust on this pitch to try something new? And pitch by pitch, you can kind of incrementally get closer to your target, which I think is really exciting because in the past, players would just have to rely on trial and error, or maybe crossing paths with the right coach at the right time, or the right teammate who could teach a grip or something that would work. I mean, that has worked for players in the past, but it wasn't a very scientific, rigorous process, and it could fail a lot of guys. And this new process, if you're in a facility or with a team, or you even have this technology yourself, you can really kind of empower yourself and be the master of your own career.
It has been, as a Cardinals fan, it's been a little bit tough these past few years for like watching all these players go to like Houston and suddenly become much, much better. I was secretly hoping as I read your book that there'd be one hidden page in which you're like, oh, but there's this new cool thing that St. Louis is doing that is going to revolutionize all their prospects. But alas, I still feel like our team's far behind. Like I see like the Tony Cingrani and all the people that go to like the Dodgers and they switch their pitch mix just a little bit, and all of a sudden they're like so much better. And I want that to be the case for my team.
Yeah, the Dodgers, the Yankees, the Astros, they've kind of been at the cutting edge here. And it's funny because the Cardinals have historically been an organization that's known for player development. That's sort of been their strength in the past, where you have the Cardinals way and prospects would be drilled and instructed in the same way with the same philosophy all the way up through the system so that they weren't hearing conflicting messages. And that was all good. But I think they were kind of the masters of traditional player development and maybe weren't as quick to get on board with this new player development revolution. And so, as I mentioned, this is more of a player-centric, coach-centric story than a team-centric one, but the one team that does get featured in the book and actually is the subject of the longest chapter is the Astros, just because everyone knows about their results at the major league level. They won a World Series a couple of years ago. They're still probably the best team in baseball, but they have so much going on all the way throughout their minor league system. They have a real wealth of prospects, and it's not an accident. It's the fact that they realized that the game was going this way, and they pivoted to player development before anyone else did, and they invested heavily in technology, and they expanded their minor league staff, and they really got rid of a lot of people who kind of weren't with the program and were doing things in the old way and weren't willing to adapt. So they were sort of ruthless in a lot of ways, but it has paid off in their player development. And now they have this track record not only of taking prospects, guys they draft or sign, and getting the most out of their ability, but then also acquiring major league players, veterans in many cases, and guys who've been pretty accomplished too, and finding something about them that could be better, saying, you know, you could throw this pitch that's really good, just throw it more, or throw it here instead of there, or pick up this pitch, or change your swing in this way. And so the Astros just have this litany of trade acquisitions that they sit down, they show them the video, they show them the numbers, the heat maps, they persuade them they're great at communicating why they think players should do things and selling them on that. And every time it works, it makes buy-in easier with the next guy to come along. And so everyone from, you know, Ryan Presley, generic right-handed reliever, to Justin Verlander, future Hall of Famer, they have acquired and yet found some untapped talent within them.
Just so wild, so wild. There's one to tie this into our one of our translation issues, and I have to talk to you about craft things related to this. One of the funny parts that I found in here is on 256 when you mentioned that Kyle Bodie and the Driveline crew found out about the idea of the elbow spiral in a book on pitching mechanics by Japanese instructor Kazushi Tezuka. Yeah. And that they had to pay to get translated. So the book, The Identity of Pitching, they paid for the English language translation to have it have access to that information, which is fundamentally what the job of my press is. So, except we do mostly fiction. Nevertheless, like that's the kind of thing that would be really cool to find and know about.
Yeah, well, that's part of this movement is that the information can come from anywhere. And I think there's much less gatekeeping when it comes to what's your background. Do you have the background that traditionally you've had to have in order to have a voice in these conversations? I mean, this is sort of the next step, the next phase of this movement where in the past you had Bill James, you had these sabermetrics outsiders who were really kind of working on their own, far from the game. They hadn't played the game at any level, but they had these great ideas. And it took some time for those ideas to be adopted and for those people to be hired in front offices. And now the same thing is happening in the coaching ranks in player instruction, which previously was kind of the last bastion of just former players. That was how you became a coach, was you just transitioned from, you know, retiring right into coaching players. And so you would instruct players the way you were instructed. And what was good enough for you was good enough for the next generation. And so there was a stagnation there. And I think there was a suspicion of the idea that someone who hadn't played could help someone play better. But now I think if you have the ideas, if you have the data, if you have the curiosity, and you're willing to learn and you have some track record of making players better, that's what teams care about. So if you're a Twitter guru, if you're a college coach, if you never played at a high level, it doesn't matter. It's more about what you can do than what you've done.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So how did this book come about? Because one thing that surprised me, well, it doesn't surprise me because I knew that what you were talking about through the podcast, but the fact that it goes through most of the 2018 season and is out now, halfway through the 2019 season seems like wildly quick because there's so much research that's in here and so much detail and just a wealth of knowledge and information that just surprised me that you're able to pull this all together that fast.
Well, thank you. I think we surprised ourselves, and it was sort of desperation driving inspiration because we had to. We were on this crash schedule, and we had to get everything together very quickly, and we felt a lot of pressure, not just because our contract said you have to deliver the manuscript by this date, but also because we thought this was really the time to write about this book. That, some people had started kind of writing articles here and there about aspects of the story, but we didn't think anyone had tied it together and made it this thesis and connected it to the past and speculated about the future. And we thought this was really the time to do it when it would still be somewhat new to most fans and yet was already somewhat entrenched in the game. And, if we waited another year or two, then this would maybe just be common knowledge. It wouldn't be seen as so revelatory. So I think that, this was the time, and we pushed ourselves really hard, and we were not great husbands for a while, and we weren't great friends, and we just sort of secluded ourselves and focused on this book. And Travis and I talked about doing the book together for the first time last March of 2018.
Holy Jesus.
We had to deliver the first draft of the manuscript by December, and it was a very quick turnaround. There was a lot of reporting, a lot of research. None of this was just sort of easy, talking about our own experiences for the most part, or just musing about things. It was all kind of information that we had to glean from somewhere, and it was just sort of all we did for a while. And of course, we had some familiarity with the subject and some awareness of where we wanted to take it, because we'd been in this world and we'd covered it to a certain extent for our respective sites. So we weren't coming in completely cold, but it was still intimidating, and there were parts of the process where we thought we would never get it done.
But how did you split up the writing duties for this? Because I know the only rule is It Has to Work has you guys going back and forth by chapters. Right. But this didn't seem like that was the case. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I just didn't pick up on it, but it didn't feel like the two different voices.
Well, I'm glad that you say that, for one thing, because we wanted it to feel pretty seamless, or at least not jarring when you go from one person to the next. And we didn't do alternating chapters the way that Sam and I did with The Only Rule, but we did split up the chapters just based on our interests, our expertise, our previous familiarity with the subject, our connections, our geographical location, whatever made it make sense for one of us to take something and one of us to take the other. And then we would each do the initial drafts, and then we would pass them back and forth, and we would tweak and correct and revise and give feedback, and then we would adjust from there. And often, we would end up migrating certain parts from one person's chapter to another, or, it started as some Ben chapters and Travis chapters, but they really did end up all as Ben and Travis chapters, because we kind of each had our fingers in everything.
The one that's very clear is when you mention that it's you that takes all the tests, like the swinging tests and the pitching which sounds horrifying. In a way.
That was the one first-person element of the book. My first book, The Only Rule, was all first person. It was Sam and I just sort of telling our story, which we had witnessed and we could kind of describe from memory, which in some ways was easier to do. And it was an easier narrative to construct because we were telling the story of a single season and a single team, and it was sort of a limited scope, and these are the characters and this is what happened. And in this book, it's such a broad subject, like the past, present, and future of player development. In baseball, you could take that almost anywhere. So the big challenge was figuring out who are the characters and what are the chapters and how do we structure this. And we didn't want it to feel like a bunch of disjointed essays on a theme. We wanted it to feel like a story that would flow. And that was difficult because there weren't always natural connections, and hopefully we mostly pulled it off. But that was the one section that was kind of one of our voices, just a first-person experience, because, we were not the ones driving this movement. It was players, it was coaches, it was teams. We were telling their story. But in this one section, we thought it would be fun and also important to test out all this technology ourselves, kind of put ourselves through the same process that players do, and be able to describe it through the lens of a very casual, non-professional athlete, which hopefully was fun to read about. And I got to be very self-deprecating about it, which wasn't hard because putting all of these sensors on myself just kind of confirmed all the things that I already knew about why I'm not a Major League Baseball player.
Yeah, fair. But still, it would be fun to get all that data.
Yeah, it was.
The thing that, one of the things that you've influenced Effectively Wild, and especially The Only Rule Has to Work, I read that when it first came out, that has influenced me is you guys plus this philosopher named, what is his name? Is it Franco Moretti, who writes about distance learning or distance reading, where instead of like in normal English classes, you're always taught to do close reading, looking at the text very closely. His idea is to look at much larger bigger groups of data and of books to see like what works and doesn't work. And in the publishing world, that you probably, because of the Ringer, and I'm curious about the Ringer, I'm going to lead to the Ringer in a second, but in the publishing world, we don't have data on basically anything. There's like sales information, which is questionable at best and incomplete, and then basically nothing else. So it's always been like a weird game of like aspiration and gut feeling, and like the feedback loops are like your sales did well or didn't do well. The bookseller liked the cover or didn't like the cover. The editor suggested this change because they had a feeling. Like a lot of things like that are really mushy compared to like what you guys have done for baseball and for Game That I Love, and the way to think about it. So I've tried for like a year and a half to synthesize like trying to think about publishing in books differently and different ways of feedback loops or ways to approach getting some sort of data that would be useful. And it's really weird when it gets into translations, which I can fill you in on in a minute. But have you found like, so what has your experience been with that, especially with the Ringer? Because you guys must use a lot of, you have more data and more readers and more clicks. You have some idea on like what things people are reacting to or not reacting to. And has that influenced your writing in any way?
It really hasn't, and all of that is kind of sequestered from me. I'm sure that's going on the editorial side, on the business side, but I think I'm grateful for the fact that they don't inundate us with that sort of data, because I think it's funny because I talk in the book about how there's this perception that players can't perform if they have all this information, that it'll just get in their heads. And I think that's probably overblown, that a lot of players benefit from having this information. And yet I almost feel that way about myself. I don't want to know how many people are reading my articles. I don't want to be tempted to have to write only things that I think will get a lot of clicks. I mean, I guess I have to justify my presence on the payroll in some way. I need people to read my articles, but I don't want it to be kind of this naked traffic grab, and there are a lot of sites, I think, where that is constantly drilled into you. You have quotas, you have to have this many hits, and for me that would be kind of exhausting. And at Grantland and at the Ringer, which largely have the same management, I have been very fortunate to kind of be protected from that. And if I ask, if I want to know how something is doing, they'll tell me, but they almost will never say anything to me about it, which I take as a good sign. I assume that if I weren't doing well, they would tell me. So I'm kind of okay just not knowing the data, which is interesting because I'm writing these very data-centric pieces often, but I have almost no data on how my pieces are doing, and I kind of like it that way. But it's funny, you talk about the publishing industry. That was sort of a source of frustration for Travis and me, and something we talked about a lot as we were working on this book. Now, I think it's worked out okay. It seems to be selling. It seems to be doing well. We're happy with the reception to it so far. But, of course, there's no way to know how it would have done in a different world with a different title and a different cover and a different marketing strategy. And that was something that we talked about a lot because we were writing about these optimizing development practices in baseball. And meanwhile, when we talked to our publisher, it was like, well, here's the title we like, and here's the subtitle we like, and here's what we think the cover should be. And sometimes we disagreed and sometimes we didn't, and no one had any empirical basis for for saying any of this. And it was like, shouldn't we be, I don't know, focus grouping this or doing some sort of survey like Amazon Turk or some kind of crowdsourcing something to get some data on how this will be received? And they're just, I don't know what the marketing department does or if anything, but no information was shared with us. It's just kind of, I guess, feel and experience and sort of the same practices we were decrying in the book, which is ironic. But I don't know what the best way to get that kind of immediate feedback is, whether it is just kind of, surveying potential readers and saying, would you buy this book? I mean, that's, what people do in TV and movies, just kind of workshopping these ideas. Maybe something like that could work in publishing, but I know the margins are usually not great and you may not have money to burn on feeling out the audience beforehand. So it's a really tough problem, I think.
And the Amazon's been trying to do some stuff, supposedly, theoretically, with their, because they have data on how far people read from in their Kindle books. Right. So although the sales for Kindle stuff is like kind of paused and plateaued, they still have a lot of people that read stuff on there, and they know when they quit, they know what time they read. They know like what time would be the best time to send someone an ad for a particular book. Like a lot of data stuff is housed in Amazon, but that's like a black box, obviously.
Yeah.
And
or you think they could
different.
do, A/B testing or something on the covers, maybe at Amazon, if they came up with a few different cover designs and just, showed people randomly one or the other and see if they buy one more often, or even titles. I guess it would be confusing to put multiple titles and covers out there, and people would wonder, is this a different book from that book? So maybe you can't do that, but something along those lines to get some kind of information about what the public thinks and not just what the few people who are making this decision think.
It is. It's something I thought about too. And the problem is that Amazon could do certain things like that, but then you'd cut out all the independent bookstores, which are the ones that really are driving a lot of like sales and like the word of mouth and getting books into people's hands, even if unfortunately people find the book in the store and then go and buy it at Amazon and the store doesn't get anything from that. But you could do that at Amazon with testing. We've been doing focus groups for our covers of sending it to a bunch of booksellers and sales reps. But that again are the people who already have like a set viewpoint. So they're like, it seems less like it's like less empirical than it is already pre-selected group of fans.
Right. Yeah. Well, there must be someone out there who's trying to disrupt publishing and do data-centric publishing. I don't know. Maybe it'll be you.
So I've dreamt there at some point in time this summer. I have a writing retreat. I'm going to work on something that sort of maybe will merge these two things in a way, but probably will just be a week alone where I write a bunch of stuff that doesn't ever get published, which is fine. It's just an enjoyable part. But there was a time. There's a few things that there's a number of things, as I mentioned to you, that Effectively Wild and Sam's articles and your articles have like inspired in trying to write a weekly post for our 3% website, which I generally write about international literature or some new book. But I get so bored with writing like, here's what this book's about. Here's a review. So I've been trying to come up with new and interesting ways to like frame stuff. And a while ago, I did one on, there's the most famous one kind of, or the one that's most read, I assume, that people mention, is an idea of treating authors like soccer players, where a publisher could acquire their career and then sell them when they become famous to a larger publisher and use that to develop new writers. It's like a way of being compensated, because right now, the way this system works is like we could publish an author, which this happens to us a lot. We'll publish an author, a French author, say they'll do really well, and then the next book comes along and we don't have a chance to publish it because a bigger press will pay more money for it, and then they'll make all the money off of the sales. But we've like paved that way. So we're like the minor league system or whatever. So I was trying to figure out a way to fix that. And then I came up with one that was all based on like crazy sabermetric ideas of like how you could try and predict if a book would be good or not, or how much profit it would make, and included all kinds of like made up, just junky ass like equations, including like sales times readership based on the author's like marketing platforms and all kinds of like random things. But that's when I was thinking about that when I heard on the podcast where you said that there were publishers who had rejected your proposal, and I kind of couldn't believe that, because like you have such a wide fan base, and it seems like it would be such an easy sell to like be able to do this book that kind of shocked me.
Well, Travis and I thought so, but I mean, I understand when you're making a big commitment, and again, you don't have the data. Like I've written about, box office predictions and some of the numbers and models that people will use to, try to take a concept or take the stars and see what they're worth. And I don't know that anyone's doing that for books, but yeah, I mean, Travis and I felt like this was a big idea, that it would have some resonance beyond baseball, that people would see parallels in other fields and industries, which I think has happened. And yeah, we each have a somewhat devoted readership who's kind of followed our work, and we felt like they would support it, and that would be a decent base. But I don't blame anyone for passing on it, because I think there was a lot of it in the proposal stage that was still somewhat nebulous. And even when we wrote our proposal, we didn't exactly know what the book would be. And a lot of it was, well, we'll talk to this guy, and, we think that this will be a big part of the book. But a lot of it was, following people in the 2018 season, which hadn't happened yet. And so you don't know what you're going to get out of that. And a lot of people said, this sounds like a good article, but not a good book, or it doesn't sound like it has a narrative or a story. It sounds like a collection of articles or something, which I think it could have been. Like that was a real risk, and it was difficult to figure out how to structure it in a way that wouldn't fulfill those fears. But I understand why people had them.
Yeah, I can see that. The way that this is working out, like in terms of the business for translated literature, is that when we started 10 years ago, and I worked at a publishing house for 10 years before that, that started doing a lot of translations. There were very, very few. Like the famous statistic is that 3% of all books published here are translated, but that's an exaggeration. It's like for fiction, like nowadays 600, but 10 years ago it was under 300. It was right around 300, 360. And so there just wasn't that much available. So for a small press, you could say we'd like the Tampa Bay Rays this, where like we couldn't afford to get the big American authors that would sell a lot of copies, but we could find really great books overseas that no one else was paying attention to. So you're like exploited that, I guess, and we're able to do a lot of stuff to become established as a publishing house and finding these interesting authors that, as I said, kind of moved on. But then at this point, now because of that success, there's so many more publishers that are doing translated literature. There's now, the total number of books is almost doubled. There's a lot of competition for the books. It's like become a different game. And they're trying to figure out like, well, what's next? Like the sales have stayed steady. You're just sort of like treading water in a weird way. So you're trying to figure out what the next step is. And one idea that I had from this and from other things was like working with maybe not even authors, but working with individual translators and sort of cultivating that translator become better at finding the right sort of books for us that will sell and working with us and developing that way. So a different form of player development, translator development. All the listeners are freaking out right now. They're probably like, no, do not start talking about translators as commodities.
Well, that makes perfect sense. It sounds very much like baseball. If you had a market inefficiency and then everyone else caught up and now it's not underpriced anymore, so you got to figure something else out. And yeah, maybe some form of development will work.
It'd be fun. It'd be super fun to be able to employ some of these things that from my one true love into publishing, but God knows it's a stretch. And the market research is non-existent. The only thing that does exist it's not even really close though, is we put together a translation database starting in 2008 that tracks all new books in translation by like title, author, year, or like language, country of origin, gender of the translator of the author. So you can look through and see like what's becoming trendy or what's not. And they're actually like, you'd probably be interested in this. A guy from Quartz magazine just did an article about the database where he put everything into R to try and figure out statistical lines that he could use for his business-based article, and found some interesting stuff, mostly that like more than half of the translations come from a very small number of countries, that we really don't have that much diversity in translations.
Oh, interesting.
But yeah, so there's like there's ways that are there, it feels like, but publishing is still like the old school, like gut feeling. I love this book. I think this book will resonate, that kind of aspirational thinking. So
Yep.
It's different. Speaking of aspirations, so I think we could end by talking about our favorite player, Willians Astudillo, who got called back up.
Yeah.
Unfortunate.
Yeah, I'm sorry for you that you don't get to see him in person, but I'm happy that he's back in the big leagues and everyone gets to see him and he gets to perform on that stage. But man, he made the most of his 9 games or so in Rochester this year. He was crushing the ball.
He did. We went to see the one of the first games that he came back. I think it was like the first home game after he got sent down. And he first pitch home run, which was amazing. But yeah, just looking, apparently he batted 526, 525, 763 with a WRC plus of 230.
Yep, he is minimum 40 plate appearances, the best hitter in all of AAA this year.
Amazing. Love that guy. For anyone who, I'm going to post, I'll put a GIF of a couple of the Willians Astudillo famous GIFs on the post for this particular podcast. But he's a great player and an outlier, and someone that I know you're really interested in because he doesn't fit any mold. So again, he's like an interesting guy.
Yeah, very much so. He's someone who was sort of discounted because of his height and his build and his skill set, and nothing really matches the typical major leaguer or the way that the game is played today. And yet he is more or less making it work. I don't know if he's a star in terms of his actual on-field performance, but he's certainly a star in terms of his personality and the way he has ingratiated himself with not just Twins fans, but baseball fans as a whole. He's just so much fun to watch play. He has such an infectious personality, and he never strikes out, which just makes him an object of fascination in this day and age where everyone strikes out. I don't know how he does it, and part of me wants to know exactly how he does it, and part of me just wants it to remain a mystery forever unexplained. So I love Willians Astudillo, and I wish him a long, happy, and healthy career.
I'm sort of surprised by the number of stolen bases he has. He had 8 in the minor leagues.
Sneaky fast. He plays every position. He's just great in so many ways.
I did get for Father's Day a T-shirt, a Willians Astudillo T-shirt that's like, it has like that thing from Instagram where he's like, I wanted to show that even if you have a body like this, you can still run. Yeah. So yeah, it's very cool. He's very inspirational.
Yeah. Inspirational figure, yeah.
I love him. So, well, thank you again for doing this. It's really fun talking to you.
Yeah, fun talking to you too. You gave me a lot to think about publishing.
Yeah, cool. It is kind of weird to hear your voice and be able to respond to it.
Yes,
after so many episodes, but
yeah, I have that same experience when I talk to people whose podcasts I listen to. Oh, they're real people and they will respond. That's great. But it's always kind of a weird dynamic because you've heard the person so many hours of your life and they don't know you in many cases, and so you're coming to the conversation with all this knowledge about them that they don't have about you, and it leads to some awkward interactions at times, or at least it has for me. But this was not one of them. This was a lot of fun.
Good deal, man. Well, thank you very much again.
My pleasure.